Individuality gives up that reflectedness into self which is expressed in lines and lineaments and places its essence in the work it has done. Herein it contradicts the relationship established by the instinctive reason, which is engaged in observing the self-conscious individuality, ascertaining what its inner and outer are supposed to be. This point of view leads us to the thought which really lies at the base of the science, if one wishes to call it such, of physiognomy. The antithesis which this observation encounters has the form of the antithesis of the practical and the theoretical, both falling within the practical aspect itself. The antithesis of individuality making itself actual in its doing in its most general sense, and individuality as being at the same time reflected out of this doing into itself and making this its object. Observation accepts this antithesis in the same inverted relationship which characterizes it in the sphere of appearance. It regards as the unessential outer the deed itself and the performance, whether it be that of speech or a more durable reality. But it is the being within self of the individuality which is for it the essential inner. Of the two aspects possessed by the practical consciousness, intention and deed, what is meant or intended by the deed and the deed itself, observation selects the former as the true inner. The intention is supposed to have its more or less unessential expression in the deed, but it has its true expression in the shape of the individuality. The latter expression is the immediate sensuous presence of the individual spirit. The inwardness which is supposed to be the true inner is the particularity of the intention and the singleness of the being for self. Both together are the spirit as only meant or intended. What observation has for its objects is thus an existence which is only meant, and it looks for laws between such existences. Paragraph 319 is exploring an opposition that's at, you might say, a higher level than the opposition, or if you like, antithesis. That's the term that Miller translates Gegensatz by over and over again. There's a higher level antithesis going on here between two different perspectives, one of which is the more adequate perspective, but which is being overlooked. The other of which is the perspective that observing reason in its instinctual activity, in the way it applies itself in, you might say, a less reflective, unthinking way to the phenomenon that it's attempting to study, is going to end up projecting onto what it's making sense of. And this can be understood in a contrast between the theoretical and the practical that's discussed here in very interesting ways. We'll go into that. This is Vernunftinstinct, right? So this is the instinct of reason, or reason acting in an instinctual way. And the goal is to get beyond that. Interestingly, reason is casting itself as being sort of a higher level perspective. What's going on with the self-conscious individuality is seen as being at a lower level, except insofar as it has to do with the theoretical, which is what reason is really most interested in at this point. So let's take a look at the text itself. He says, individuality gives up that reflectedness into self, which is expressed in lines and lineaments. Remember, we're talking about physiognomy here. And places its essence in the work it has done. We've seen this in the previous paragraphs. What it is that we're actually externalizing into the world is where the essence is. This is something typically Hegelian. Whatever is inner must become outer. Whatever is presumed to be driving things behind the scene must appear, must show itself. And it's no different with the human person. So he says, herein it contradicts the relationship established by this instinctive reason, which is engaged in what? Observing the self-conscious individuality. Why is it observing the self-conscious individuality, as we're going to see at the end of the paragraph and in the paragraphs to come? Because it wants to derive laws about the individuality, but about individualities in general, laws that will allow us to figure out how people are going to behave based on what types of people they're going to be. So in a certain way, it's treating the individual as individual, but it's also treating the individual as generic type. Now, the individual, him or herself, is working in a somewhat different way. So let's follow this out. He says, the point of view of reason leads us to the thought which really lies at the basis of science, if one wishes to call it such, of physiognomy. And we don't need to dwell too long on the fact that Hegel considers physiognomy, rightly so, to be a pseudoscience. What is a pseudoscience? It's something that has an ology to it, right? There's an account, there's a reason, there might be all sorts of nice charts and drawn up, arrows connecting things and predictions made. But it turns out to be without any real, genuine basis. And it's not just that it doesn't continue to predict when it's transferred from situation to situation. It doesn't provide a genuine intelligibility of the phenomenon. That's what science, Wissenschaft, for Hegel is supposed to do, particularly when it's a science of the human being, a Geisteswissenschaft in German, literally a spiritual science or a science of the human being. It has to take into account the very fact that we are not only the subjects but also the objects of the scientific inquiry. And physiognomy fails at that. So what he's looking at here is what lies at the basis of it. So he says the antithesis which this observation, the observation made by reason, encounters has the form of the antithesis of the practical and the theoretical. And this is indeed an opposition, right? Now, here's where a lot needs to be said, but perhaps not so much at this point, because we're going to see this play itself out over and over again, and I've mentioned this in other videos as well. There are different ways in which we can look at the interrelation, or if you like, the opposition or the antithesis, between the practical and the theoretical. Now, one way is to say that the practical is really something that is subordinate. It just follows from the theoretical. What's most important is, speculative reason, theoretical reason, pure reason, if you like. And it looks at things the way they are. And then once we've deduced some laws, or we've deduced, some schemas, or some way of thinking about things, then we get to the practical stuff. And that's just sort of a matter of application afterwards. And so if you think about, the way in which, for example, Kant structured the critiques, right? The first critique of pure reason. Then, after that, critique of practical reason. And then, we've got the third critique. What is that about? Well, that's a mess, right? So, but also think about Descartes. Even think about people who were engaging in the modern period in what is clearly practical, or as they called it, moral philosophy, like Thomas Hobbes. If you read the first part of Leviathan, it doesn't begin with practical philosophy. It begins with a theoretical account, which then can be used as a basis for providing a practical account. Right? Descartes is doing something similar in his works. Where Hegel and several other important thinkers are going right, I think, is in restoring what we can call the primacy of the practical. So, what do we mean by that? The theoretical is assumed to be better, more essential, more wesentlicher, right? More important, more architectonic, if we want to use an Aristotelian term. But isn't theoretical activity itself driven by practical motives? Isn't theoretical activity itself a kind of doing? A kind of, in the German, Handeln? It's not just practical things like, should I go buy some shoelaces or not? Or what should I do about world hunger? Or am I a nice guy or a bad guy? Or, all these sorts of things that we can think about that we might place within the realm of the practical, that are action, that are doing, that are making things happen that are motivated. It's also the entire realm of the theoretical. As a matter of fact, even making the distinction between the theoretical and the practical itself is not a purely theoretical exercise. Hegel rightly, calls our attention to the fact that we have as he calls it, a practical aspect here, right? Both the form of the antithesis of the practical and theoretical both fall within the practical aspect itself. The antithesis of individuality, making itself actual in its doing in its most general sense. Individuality is being at the same time reflected out of this doing into itself and making this its object. So what we've got here, sort of represented by this arrow, is an ambiguity. On the one hand, we can say that the practical enfolds the theoretical, sucks it back in, right? On the other hand, the theoretical does have a certain distinctness to it, a certain raison d'etre, a reason for being. And it takes what's going on with the practical and reflects on it. This is why, in the long run, it actually turns out to be, practically speaking, a little pun there, impossible to maintain very rigid distinctions between the theoretical and the practical in philosophy. Because, as it turns out, the theoretical is imbued with the practical, and the practical itself relies upon the theoretical. Theorizing is going on within that. Just for one example, which Hegel's not talking about here, and this is a larger scale thing, I do a lot of work on Aristotle, and Aristotle does like to make a rigid distinction between, a theoretical use of reason and a practical use of reason, or the intellect. And he talks about disciplines as doing that. Now, political science, he politicae episteme for him, is a practical thing. It's supposed to culminate ultimately in action. And when he says action, we can also think attitudes and arrangements of affairs and resolutions and things along those lines. Now, you might say, okay, so political science or ethics, those are supposed to be culminating in action. Well, is the discipline itself, is the book that you wrote here, that we're reading, that we're puzzling through, is that supposed to lead us immediately to action, or even at the very end of it? Doesn't seem so. And why did you bother studying this stuff and devoting so much attention to it, Aristotle? And this is a question that he doesn't really have a good answer for, other than, a generality, all men by nature desire to know. Sure, know in a theoretical sense, where there's no practical effects or implications coming from it right away, but perhaps we can apply it down the line. Aristotle is interested in what makes human beings tick, why are they so screwed up, and how can they become a little less screwed up so that they could live in a society together and start realizing a portion of the human good. Now, those are very practical questions, but those are also theoretical questions. We can say the same way, going back to Hegel, about this entire book. Now, to go back to what he's talking about in this paragraph, we can similarly say this at a sort of lower level, individual scale about the action of the individual, him or herself. So Hegel is going to talk about how this plays itself out. And the practical, we look at in terms of, there's more to the practical than this, but oftentimes we make this distinction between the intention, which we see as interior to the person, and then its externalization in the deed, the thought, what it is that they actually do, the action. Or, if you like, the performance. And the performance in this case could be, Hegel mentions, speech or language, or it could be some sort of reality that's created, like a book, like a tie, like all sorts of other, like writing things on the chalkboard, all sorts of other things, right? So he goes on and he says, Here we go. Observation accepts this antithesis in the same inverted relationship which characterizes it in the sphere of appearance. It regards as the unessential outer the deed itself and the performance. Reason doesn't get that this is where things are happening. This is the actual. And he says it is looking instead at the being within itself of the individuality, which for it is the essential inner. And then he says, of the two aspects possessed by the practical consciousness, intention and deed, what is meant or intended by the deed and the deed itself. Now notice the reversal that's happening there. We're thinking of it as, well, there's the intention, and the intention itself is the meaning or the intending, and that produces the deed. Hegel's actually, as a good phenomenologist, saying, what are you actually observing? The deed. You get to see the deed. Oftentimes, even with ourselves, we do something, and we're like, well, why the hell did I do that? What was I trying to do when I said that to that person, or when I arranged things in that way? Was I even thinking about it? And we can reconstruct this for other people. Similarly, we see the deed, and then we say there's some sort of meaning, some sort of intending going on there. And he says, observation selects this as the true inner. The intention is supposed to have its more or less unessential expression in the deed. The deed is not really essential. You've got the sort of thinking about it and then doing. And the doing just kind of happens. It's afterwards. It's not that important. What's really important is what a person is thinking. Hegel's saying, no. That's putting the cart before the horse, because in this case, we only actually see the horse. Right? And he goes on and he says, here we go. The latter expression is the immediate sensuous presence of the individual spirit. The inwardness, which is supposed to be the true inner, is the particularity of the intention and the singleness of the being for self. Both together are the spirit as only meant or intended. So what observation has for its objects is thus an existence which is only meant. That's a problem, because what we want is something that's more than just meaning or intending or even gesturing. So we're going to have to turn to the deed, and we will be doing that in the future paragraphs. Now notice how he ends this, like I mentioned before. It looks for laws between such existences. It looks for laws that govern what we actually observe, which that's not really essential for reason, but it really is for the individuality. And then the intention, a kind of ghostly thing floating in the background. Can we produce laws about that? Well, that's what we're going to see him discussing in the following paragraphs. The forming of opinions prima facie about the presumed outward presence of spirit is natural or everyday physiognomy, the over-hasty judgment formed at first sight about the inner nature and character of its outer shape. The object of this opinion is of such a kind that its essence involves its being in truth something else than merely sensuous immediate being. True, it is also just this reflectedness into self out of sense in sensuous form, and this which is visibly present as visibility of the invisible is the object of observation. But just this sensuous immediate presence is the reality of spirit only for mere opinion. And observation, in keeping with this aspect, busies itself with this presumed existence of spirit, with physiognomy, handwriting, sound of voice, etc. It connects such existence with just such a presumed inner. It is not the murderer, the thief, who is to be recognized, but the capacity to be one. The fixed abstract quality thereby gets lost in the concrete, infinitely determinate character of the particular individual, which now demands more skillfully contrived delineations than those qualifications are. Such ingenious delineations certainly say more than the qualification murderer, thief, or good-natured, unspoiled, and so on, but they are far from being adequate for their purpose, which is to express the presumed being or the particular individuality. As inadequate as the delineations of the bodily shape which go no further than a flat forehead, a long nose, etc. For the individual shape, like the individual self-consciousness, is, qua a being that is meant, inexpressible. The science of knowing men, which deals with the supposed human being, like the science of physiognomy, which deals with his presumed reality, and aims at raising the unconscious judging of everyday physiognomy to the level of knowledge, is therefore something which lacks both foundation and finality. It can never succeed in saying what it means because it merely means, and its content is something merely meant. In paragraph 320, Hegel is talking about how it is that a pseudoscience, in this case physiognomy, a body of presumed knowledge about human nature, about human types, about the ways in which we can tell what people are and how they're going to act and what tendencies they have. He's talking here about how it fails to do what it's pretending to do. And, he uses a lot of language of spirit here. And it's important for us to keep in mind as we're reading this that the translator has to make a choice. In German, Geist is both spirit in the sense of being something elevated, or also spirit in the old theological sense, but it also means mind as well. Similarly to how in French esprit means mind and spirit, and also wit. And so we want to keep that in mind when he's talking in this paragraph about how we're observing spirit here, because it's not just the individual who's being observed by observing reason as sort of a bug under the glass, or a microbe under the microscope. It goes beyond that, right? We're trying to observe human beings and say something really essential about them through this presumed science, and Hegel's rejecting physiognomy as a science. So he starts out by talking about the forming of opinions prima facie about the presumed presence of spirit. And what does he mean there? Well, opinion is Meinung, and we've seen this in the previous paragraph in terms of intention, or in terms of sort of a gesturing, and that's really all that's going on when we're in the realm of mere opinion. He'll talk about this a little bit more in the next paragraph as well, but this is an important part. So he says, what we're doing is we're trying to have opinions about the presence of spirit, the presence of what it is that's really distinctive about human beings. And he talks about natural or everyday physiognomy, the over-hasty judgments formed at first sight about the inner nature and character of its outer shape. So, we do this a lot, and it's good here that he's talking not just in terms of a developed, purportedly scientific, with all the trappings that scientists bring, discipline of physiognomy that might be in books, that one might take courses on, but also the fact that people do this in an everyday or less reflective way as well. When we look at somebody and we say, I just don't like the fact that his eyes are so close together, that makes me think that he's less trustworthy, we're engaging in what Hegel is discussing here as everyday physiognomy. Another application that just sort of came to mind for me, which is quite important, particularly in this age of photoshopping and constant imagery, is the fact that we do, in fact, we know this from psychologists studying this, we do in fact tend to trust people more who we think are attractive in certain senses. And a lot of that turns out to be matters of proportion and symmetry. There's really no good reason why we should do that, right? I mean, there's certainly no rational reason why we should. But we do engage in this kind of everyday physiognomy. Culture can play an incredible role with it. You might think, for example, about the demonization that's happened for centuries for certain human types. People, it wasn't that long ago when somebody who had some sort of handicap, physical problem with their frame would be sort of singled out. Oh, that's the bad guy, I know, because he's showing up in the movie and he's, got some sort of problem with his body. There must be something wrong with that person. So this is something that we engage in today, I think, just as much as people did in Hegel's time. We just do it in different manners. You can read all sorts of, great blog entries and, go to pick stuff off the supermarket stands in various magazines, people giving you advice about how to tell if somebody's lying, somebody's this kind of character or not. And really what we should be looking at, what's not talked about here, but we did talk about in the last paragraph, is the deed, the action, or even, the way a person talks over time. There are consistent patterns. But we're not looking at that. Instead, we're looking at their outer shape, their lineaments, particularly the face. So he goes on and he says, the object of this opinion, of this Meinung, is of such a kind its essence involves its being in truth something else than merely sensuous immediate being. We're trying to say something about more than just what we are perceiving on the surface. We're saying we can look into what a person is. And he says, true, it is also just this reflectedness into itself out of sense in sensuous form. And here he talks in terms of this metaphor of visibility. The soul, the psyche, the personality is something that is invisible. And geistige, or spiritual things, are not something that are primarily visible. So the invisible is turned visible as the inner is externalized into the outer. The question is, what's the relation between the inner and the outer here? You notice that, I should point out here, we think that the outer shape expresses the inner nature. Why? Because it's presumed that the inner nature is somehow causing the external shape. So there's a reciprocal relation here between the inner and the outer. And it allows us, like I said, too, to dispense with looking what a person actually does and to talk about how a person appears. So he goes on and he says, just this sensuous immediate presence is the reality of spirit only for mere opinion. Mere opinion is getting the reality of spirit wrong. Observation, in keeping with this aspect, busies itself with this presumed existence of spirit, with physiognomy. With what else? Handwriting, sound of voice. We might look at all sorts of other things, other physical manifestations of what we take to be inside a person as the examples of what Hegel is talking about here as this broad discipline of physiognomy. We don't use that term anymore. We talk in terms of other things. We talk, for example, about profiling people. We talk, for example, about having a first impression. Right? And we've done all sorts of interesting psychological studies, which you don't want to draw too much from. But if you do notice that the same guy dressed in a suit and tie is treated quite differently than when he looks like a homeless bum, sitting on the street wrapped in a blanket or something like that. Okay, appearances do in fact matter. And why do they matter? They matter because people are assuming that the outer does in fact show us something of the inner, and the inner is what is geistige. The inner is what is spirit. So he goes on and he says, it constructs such existence with such a presumed inner. Does this inner really exist. There's something there, right? He talks about the reflectiveness into self, right? Okay, so self-consciousness, we are able to be reflective, we're able to take into account, how we look, what we do, and make an issue of that. We're able to bring that forward in our minds and remember it and say, I want to do this more, I want to do this less. All of that is true, right? Does that mean that we have the inner the way that physiognomy represents it? No, it doesn't. So he says, here he's got some great examples. It's not the murderer, the thief, who is to be recognized. Why would the murderer or thief be recognized? Again, how do you know if somebody's a murderer? They actually do murder somebody, right? Then they become a murderer. How do you know if they are a thief? Well, they steal stuff. Especially if you catch them red-handed. Now you can say, oh, there's a thief right there. Physiognomy, though, isn't really looking at crime records. Or if it is, it's doing so in a very different way. Because what it's interested in is the capacity to be a murderer. The capacity to be a thief. What is it about our inner character, about who it is that we are, that makes some of us susceptible to lose our temper, fly into a passion, and take a life? Or to plot the downfall of another person precisely because we want what they've got, and we're willing to violate certain moral norms and go against the fear of punishment to get it, what it is that we think that we're entitled to. That would be presumably something inner to the person, and some people would have that, and other people wouldn't have that. We can talk in terms of other things too. Who's got grit? That's a big term that people love today. It was a big thing a long time ago, and now it's come back into fashion to talk about grit. It's not something that we can quantify. People are trying to do that sort of thing, but it's something that we, do in fact presume is inside of a person. What would display grit, though? It would be only the outward action or speech. So he goes on and he says, it's the capacity to be a murderer or a thief. The fixed abstract quality thereby gets lost in the concrete, infinitely determinate character of the particular individual, which now demands more skillfully contrived delineations, and those qualifications are. So what is he talking about in that vast sentence right there? The delineations are things like murder and thief, but what are we using as the index for that? Well, all the things that we can put here and say this counts as being a sign. This counts as being an index for this characteristic. We've become much more sophisticated in how we do this these days. We might do it in terms of statistical analyses, but it would still be a matter of physiognomy in doing that. We also do this, by the way, in terms no longer so much of bumps on people's heads like phrenologists did, or measuring them with calipers, but we do it with other things like lighting up things in an MRI machine, or saying that a person has a certain chemistry or genetic disposition towards one thing or another. So what do we have there? A whole bunch of different possible signs, indices. You can compile them into books and make something out of them. And so he says, these ingenious delineations say more than the qualification, murderer, thief, or if we want, good-natured, unspoiled, and so on. But they're not adequate for their purpose. What is their purpose? Hegel tells us here. to express the presumed being or the particular individuality. Tell us what a person is in their inner nature, who they are. Are they a murderer? Are they a good-natured person? Are they someone who has grit? Are they somebody who lacks resiliency? Are they somebody, and we can go on and on and on and on, right? We can do this as well, just in terms of the big 5 dispositions. We can go on and on with this sort of thing. Some people are naturally conservative, and we can lay out those characteristics. But unless we're actually taking into account what people in fact do, we're somewhat missing the point. We're playing around, we're engaging in an imaginary exercise, and one of the big problems is, from a theoretical perspective, this is unsatisfying, this is inadequate, right? From a practical perspective, this gets us into all sorts of trouble when we start making assumptions about people based primarily on things of their appearance that are supposed to be expressions caused by what's inside of them, particularly if it leads us to misconstrue what it is that they actually do, or their patterns of engaging in linguistic behavior. So Hegel talks here about people who have flat foreheads or long noses, and he says the individual shape, like the individual self-consciousness, is qua a being that is meant inexpressible. You cannot deduce all that much from a nose, but these physiognomists were deducing all sorts of interesting things. How were they doing that? Well, they were basically making it up. In part, they would draw conclusions based on insufficient empirical evidence that was jury-rigged to get them what they want. But in part, it was probably a matter of coming up with some sort of thing that seemed systematic, and you can understand the motive. It allows you to think that you can understand human beings. Human beings are messy and complex and often surprise us. So, if you were a doctor going into prisons and looking at the people who turn up in prisons and, noticing certain physical types, could be that the officers arrest those people more often, or that, those people are more often in poverty, or all sorts of other things. Maybe there isn't actually something in there. And then you start to draw conclusions about outward shapes. So he goes on and he says, the science of knowing men, which deals with the supposed human being, like the science of physiognomy, which deals with his presumed reality, and aims at raising the unconscious judging of everyday physiognomy to the level of knowledge. It's aiming at taking this thing that we all do anyway, really without good basis, and turning it into a science. He says, something that lacks both foundation and finality. It can never succeed in saying what it means, because it merely means, and its content is something merely meant. What's lost a little bit in the English translation there is that this Meinung is reducing it to the level of opinion, and not just opinion, but individual opinion. So a researcher may write a treatise on how certain, facial features or tendency to smile or frown or something like that signify something about the character of a person, which is going to be a real capacity that we can then predict from. It's never going to be more than the intention, the imagination, the opinion of that particular researcher or the other people who they happen to captivate as a result. So what we're getting here is a really serious critique of physiognomy, and also later on of phrenology, or any kind of pseudoscience that is basing itself upon these sorts of determinations, right? What it is that we see represented in the outward frame of the person. Again, what's been left out, what needs to be restored, is attention to what the person actually does.